For decades, a British farm could pass from parent to child without the taxman touching it. That protection had a name: agricultural property relief. In October 2024, Chancellor Rachel Reeves changed it. Farmland worth more than a certain threshold would now be taxed on death, at an effective rate of up to 20%. Farmers called it the tractor tax. The Treasury called it fairness. What followed wasn't just a protest. It was thousands of farmers driving tractors into central London, and one television presenter turned working farmer doing something none of them expected, sitting down and working out in detail how the new rules could legally be avoided. That man was Jeremy Clarkson, and the loophole he described in his newspaper column is still legal today. Let's start with what actually changed, because most coverage got this wrong. The original plan capped full inheritance tax relief at £1 million per person. After sustained pressure from farming groups, the government raised that threshold to £2.5 million per person, meaning a married couple can now pass on up to £5 million in qualifying agricultural and business assets before the 20% rate applies at all. Layer on the standard nil rate band and the residence allowance, and some couples can shelter closer to £5.6 million combined. That sounds generous. The government presented it as generous. Clarkson didn't see it that way. In his Sunday Times column, he pointed out that even with the higher threshold, a significant share of farmers who would have been caught under the original £1 million cap are still caught under the new one. Raising the number moved the headline. It didn't move the underlying problem for every family it was meant to help. So Clarkson did something more useful than complaining. He modeled a real scenario: an elderly widowed farmer, one son, a farm worth more than the family's combined tax-free allowance. And he worked through exactly how that family could avoid the bill entirely, using a rule that has existed for years and has nothing to do with farming at all: full exemption on transfers between spouses. His proposal: the son divorces his wife. The elderly father marries her instead. When the father dies, the farm passes to his new wife completely free of inheritance tax, because transfers between spouses are always exempt, regardless of value. Later, she can pass the farm back to her former husband, the original son, without the same tax bill ever landing on the family in the way it would have through a normal father-to-son inheritance. It sounds absurd. It's also completely legal, and that's exactly the point Clarkson was making. Not that families should actually do this, but that a tax built to target the wealthiest landowners had left a gap wide enough for an ordinary family to walk a farm straight through it, using nothing but marriage law. Here's where the story gets more interesting than a single column. The government's own defense of the policy was that it closed a loophole being used by wealthy investors buying farmland purely to shelter money from inheritance tax. Critics on the other side made a different argument, that the new relief structure itself created fresh inequality, because a married farming couple can already claim two separate allowances, doubling their tax-free threshold in a way that unmarried farmers, or farmers without children, simply cannot access. The House of Commons Library confirmed the mechanics. The £2.5 million allowance is fully transferable between spouses, meaning couples effectively get two bites at the same relief. Clarkson's column didn't invent a new trick. He just followed that existing spousal exemption one logical step further than the government had accounted for, and handed the reasoning to every farming family in Britain for the price of a newspaper. Now, the spousal loophole isn't the only softening built into this policy, and understanding the rest of it explains why the government is willing to let gaps like Clarkson's stand. Whatever tax does eventually fall due can be paid in equal installments over 10 years, completely interest-free. That single detail rarely makes the headlines, but it matters more than almost any number in the debate. A family facing a large bill isn't forced to sell land immediately to cover it. They can spread it across a decade, which softens the argument that this tax alone will break up farms overnight. At the same time, the government tightened a separate relief that had nothing to do with farmland directly. Relief on shares listed on the alternative investment market was cut from full exemption down to 50%. That change targeted a different avoidance route entirely: wealthy individuals using AIM-listed shares as an inheritance tax shelter. And it tells you something important. This wasn't one tax change. It was several overlapping changes, each aimed at a different kind of estate, all bundled together and presented to the public as a single farm tax. There's a genuine irony sitting underneath all of this. Back in 2021, In an interview with The Times, Clarkson admitted that avoiding inheritance tax had been the critical thing behind his decision to buy diddly squat in the first place. Years later, standing at a farmer's protest, he was confronted with those exact words on camera and had to explain himself live, insisting the tax angle had only ever been a passing remark that came back to haunt him. The man who once joked about beating inheritance tax became the man publicly showing the country how the beating actually works. Now, it's worth being honest about scale here because this is where a lot of coverage overstates the story. The Country Land and Business Association estimated that as many as 70,000 farms could eventually be affected by the reforms. The government's own figures, reviewed by BBC Verify, suggested the number of estates actually paying the tax in any given year would be far smaller, in the hundreds, not the tens of thousands. Both figures are true. They're just measuring different things. How many farms could theoretically be affected over time versus how many estates are taxed in a typical year. That gap between could be affected and will pay this year is exactly why the debate has stayed this heated for so long. Farming bodies argue that even a small number of forced sales each year breaks up land that took generations to build. Treasury figures published alongside the reforms told a sharper story on the other side. A small number of very large claims accounted for a disproportionate share of the relief being claimed each year, with the largest handful of estates alone worth well over £100 million in relief between them. That single statistic is the actual justification the government leans on whenever it's challenged on fairness. Clarkson made a separate argument entirely, one that had nothing to do with the tax arithmetic. He wrote that farming inheritance isn't like inheriting an ordinary asset, because a working farm depends on generations of accumulated specific knowledge about that particular land, what grows where, what fails, what the soil needs, that can't simply be replaced by whoever buys the farm next. Break up the farm to pay a tax bill, his argument goes, and you don't just lose land. You lose institutional knowledge that took decades to build and can't be repurchased. Ministers have consistently rejected that framing, insisting the reforms only meaningfully affect a small, wealthier minority of estates, and that the reforms will raise a meaningful amount for public services every year. So here's the fuller picture. A policy aimed at a small number of very large estates ended up threatening a much wider group of ordinary working farms, because agricultural land values had simply risen to a point where an average, unremarkable farm could now cross what used to be considered a wealthy landowner threshold. The government responded to the backlash by raising the threshold, softening the payment terms, and tightening a separate loophole elsewhere, while leaving the spousal exemption gap that Clarkson described completely untouched. Whether that gap gets closed before more families quietly use it is genuinely still open. Nothing in current legislation blocks it. If you found this useful, subscribe for more breakdowns like this one. No shouting, just the actual numbers explained properly. And I'd genuinely like to know in the comments, do you think a loophole like this should be closed? Or is it just fair use of rules that already exist? Thanks for watching.